All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Governing Past Gridlock, Why Fiscal Responsibility Still Matters, and for helping us launch the Wiedenbaum Center's Spring 2026 semester. We are grateful to see such a strong turnout for what is an important and timely conversation about governance, budgeting, and the long-term health of our public institutions. My name is Andrew Reeves. I am Professor of Political Science and Director of the Wiedenbaum Center. As many of you know, the Wiedenbaum Center supports rigorous social science research, and we are equally committed to translating that work into meaningful public dialogue. We strive to serve as a bridge, connecting scholars, policymakers, students, and community members in conversation about the issues that matter most. Before we begin, I want to briefly situate today's event within the broader mission of the Wiedenbaum Center. The center itself is nonpartisan and does not advance any political agenda. At the same time, individual programs may feature specific points of view or even partisan perspectives. We take our mission very seriously. Our goal across all of our programs is to model rigorous inquiry, intellectual diversity, and civil agreement or even civil disagreement. As Chancellor Martin has emphasized through his Ordered Liberty Project, free expression is a core commitment of this university, and the Wiedenbaum Center is proud to help advance that goal. And today, fiscal responsibility is a topic that demands exactly that kind of serious, good faith engagement. Today's conversation addresses the challenges of governing in an era of polarization while confronting difficult fiscal realities, including deficits, debt, and the trade-offs required to sustain public trust and economic stability. We're especially pleased to welcome a speaker who brings experience as both a scholar and a policymaker to this discussion. Dr. Carolyn Bourdeau is the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition and Concord Coalition Action Fund, where she leads a grassroots effort to promote fiscal responsibility and address the nation's $36 trillion debt. She previously served as a Democratic member of Congress from Georgia from 2021 to 2022, working across party lines through the Problem Solvers Caucus and as a co-chair of the Blue Dog Coalition Task Force on Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform. Before entering Congress, Dr. Bourdeau was a professor of public finance at Georgia State University and served as director of Georgia's Senate Budget and Evaluation Office during the Great Recession. Following Dr. Bourdeau's remarks, we will open the floor for audience questions. And I want to remind everybody, when you ask your question, please lean into the microphone so the guests that are joining us online can hear. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Bourdeau.
Thank you. Okay, is the mic working? It's good. All right, well, good afternoon. All right, I know I'm in a semi-southern audience when people respond. So I come from Atlanta, Georgia, and you got a little bit of my bio. I have a 13-year-old son, and the other day he was having a little trouble going to sleep. And he called me in and he said, Mom, talk to me a little bit. And I was like, okay, well, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, well, tell me what you're going to be talking about, when you go to St. Louis. So I launched into, fiscal versus monetary policy and fiscal dominance, and I was just going strong. And I was about 10 minutes in when I realized, he was out cold. And the next day he said, you were talking about money or something. Anyway, so he didn't make it very far. So I'm going to endeavor to do better, all right, with this talk. I want to thank the folks at the Wiedenbaum Center, Andrew and our other wonderful Rachel, so much for bringing us here. This is a very, very important topic. It's one very, very near and dear to my heart. As you mentioned in the introduction, I spent about 20 years in academia, so I'm probably familiar with many of you and your roles and your lives, doing exactly what this center's mission is, which is trying to translate public policy for folks, to make it easy to understand, to try to, have people understand how it's really going to affect their day-to-day lives. I was in Congress. I'll talk a little bit about that. It was truly a crazy experience. I was there for 2 years, but they were very intense. Came out of that, and then folks at the Concord Coalition were looking for a new executive director to come and try to reboot this debate around the fiscal situation of our national government. And so I was like, perfect. It's got policy, it's got politics, it's got grassroots outreach. That's what I'd love to do. So that is why I'm here, and thank you so much for hosting us. So we'll start off with this slide, right? This is always a little bit eye-popping. When I was elected, I was a Democrat, but I'd spent 20 years really working on fiscal policy and working on state and local budgets and trying to get them balanced, to evaluate states, and whether states were pursuing good fiscal policy. So when I got to the federal level, I really had to breathe into the bag. I was sworn in on January 3rd of 2021. 3 days later was January 6th. 2 weeks later was impeachment. Another 2 weeks later was Biden's inauguration. And 2 weeks after that, they asked me to vote on $2 trillion of the American Rescue Plan funding. And that was, all of these things were extremely dramatic in my life. So I've spent some time really thinking about the federal debt and deficit. I got into huge tangle-ups with my own party over these issues, in part because having worked in budgets for a long time, I had a sense of the scope of the problem that we were facing and that we were going to face going forward. And it was very, very important to me that we pay for our priorities and we start tackling the debt and deficit. So this is where we are. We have about $38 trillion in debt. I pulled this a couple weeks ago, so it's already out of date. That's about $112,000 for every single person in this country. Just to give you a sense of scale, median family income is about $83,000 in this country. If that median family were spending at the rate we are, they would be spending each year around $116,000, okay? So about a $33,000 deficit every single year. And they would have a credit card balance of $630,000. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the scale of things, the federal government commands a very nice interest rate. So the interest you'd be paying on that $630,000 is about $16,000 a year. So you're going to get off, a lot lighter than I would if I was had that kind of credit card debt. But nonetheless, that is still 20% of your income. Okay, and that 20% number plays a pretty significant role in what we're facing right now. One of the great problems many economists will point out to you is not the scale of the debt so much, but the fact that there is no plan whatsoever to stop this trajectory. We are just going to continue adding to the debt. And every year, Congress comes in, and not only do they not address this issue, but they vote on different policies that make the situation worse. So last year, we took up the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and that added, I'll show you the numbers, between $3.4 and $4.1 trillion to the debt over a 10-year period. Right now, the Democrats are advancing policies. They're really pushing for these premium tax credits, the Affordable Care Act, health insurance plan. That will add $80 billion to the debt. And they are not planning on paying for any of this. And that's really one of the things that we really, as a community, need to start insisting that they pay for these priorities and they develop a plan to cut the debt. So here you can see our trajectory. You can see the World War II. This is all as a share of gross domestic product, so a share of our overall economy, so that we don't, if I were to show you the actual raw numbers, I tried running that, but right, it just goes way off the chart, right? We can't even really develop a decent graph on that. But here you can see debt is a share of gross domestic product. And you can see right now we are very close to World War II levels, right, of debt as a share of GDP. However, we are not in a major world war. We are not having a major crisis, right? So you see over here. And then, of course, this will just go on indefinitely at our current rate. Why is that? Well, here we go. Basically, we have a structural deficit. I worked at this at the state level. After the Great Recession, we had a structural deficit in Georgia. There we have a balanced budget amendment, so they sat down and they closed that gap, but this is where we are at the federal level. We don't have a balanced budget requirement, and so we have just run deficits year after year after year. You can see back, there was a period of time where I worked for Congress in the 90s, and we actually balanced the budget then. So there was this brief period where our revenue lines exceeded our expenditure lines. What happened then? We hit 9/11, we went to war, we passed a major tax cut, we passed a major spending increase, Medicare Part D, things like that, and then we hit the Great Recession, COVID, et cetera. The lines started to diverge, and now we are running right around $2 trillion annual deficits. Okay, and this again, this is our deficit as a share of GDP. All right, so just one thing I want to point out, because one of the talking points that many people have is, we're running these deficits, yes, but we can grow our way out of this, okay? So growth does play a role in how we get out of this mess, but we cannot continue to add deficits at 6% of GDP if we're going to do that. So what you're seeing here, let me see if I can get this fancy thing to work. There we go. All right, if you go over here, right, our deficits are 6% of gross domestic product, around $2 trillion. We have about a $30 trillion gross domestic product. So, whoops, go back. There we go. All right, the deal is, right, if we continue to add at 6% as a share of our economy, we are going to have to grow greater than 6% a year in order to have growth erode the deficit. Right now, this past year, 2025, analysts project that we will have grown by 2%. In 2024, we grew by 3%. So one of the challenges here is as a first step in addressing this, is to try to cut the deficit down to a level that is below the growth of the economy. So one of the initiatives we're working on at Concord is called a 3% resolution, which would cut the deficit in half. Hopefully, we will grow at 3%, which is a very optimistic growth projection. But if we are able to do that, we will stabilize the debt for a bit. All right, so that is just, pointing some of these things out as we go through this. Okay, so where are we headed? You saw those red bars, right? Over the next 10 years, we're $38 trillion in debt right now. This year, we will cross $40 trillion at least. Over the next 10 years, we will spend $88 trillion. We will bring in $65 trillion, and we will add 23 on top of the 38 trillion today. So one of the things I want people to start thinking about, I want you to think about this in terms of scale of the problem. I get a lot of people out there, they're like, oh, we're going to eliminate USAID. We're going to get rid of the Department of Education. I was actually talking to a member of the budget committee who was like, okay, we are cutting the deficit because we're getting rid of the Department of Education. The problem is, a couple $100 billion isn't going to cut it, right? We really have to hit trillions. We have to cut that $23 trillion number down. We have to bring that down. And so I want people to be thinking about that as I roll through the different options and I show you sort of what's going on with the budget. All right, we'll have debt held by the public. These are some just stats that are often thrown around. Will be 120% of GDP. Gross debt will be 135% to 140%. Here are two very important things, just kind of looking at the demographics of this audience. 2032 is important to me as well. Social Security Retirement Trust Fund will be depleted. In 2032, that will precipitate an automatic across-the-board 24% cut to benefits. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We will also deplete the Medicare Hospital Trust Fund, and that will precipitate an 11% across the board cut. Anybody who works in hospitals or healthcare, that will be your reimbursement rates that will be cut if we allow this to happen. And this is just sort of a, if we continue on status quo and don't make any changes. All right, my sister's a doctor. She tells me this is a little medical dark humor. All bleeding stops eventually. So I think about this a bit when I think about our debt. And this is very important for everybody to understand and to think about. Right now, there is no plan to cut the debt. One way or another, this is going to be dealt with. We are going to pay for this, okay? We can either do it through a controlled process where we make disciplined cuts or revenue increases. We can, in a sense, staunch the bleeding. We can patch up the patient. Or we can deal with this through an uncontrolled process, which is hyperinflation, crippling economic stagnation. Nobody quite knows what that scenario looks like. But everybody suggests that we don't just let the patient lie on the table and keep bleeding, okay? And that's what we're doing right now. We're doing faith-based budget balancing. We are hoping that it will balance itself, that there will be some miracle that will happen, and there may be a miracle, right? I can't, United States is a very lucky, very favored country in a sense, but it would be foolish of us to just let this continue in this way, because the outside risk, the risks are very, very grave of what may happen if we just let this go. Okay, so let me break down the problem for you, and then we can talk about sort of how we are going to have to tackle this. There's some big areas that we are going to have to tackle, we're going to have to think about. So first of all, let's just get familiar, get comfortable with what the federal budget is and what it does. All right. These are some of our favorite charts here. We call this whole thing the chart talk because of these particular slides. Okay. Net interest. All right. This is from 2024. We do not yet have 2025. We will get this soon. And this is up on our webpage, by the way, if you want to go and look. We have all of this information there. Okay, so 2024, net interest, $881 billion. Actually, let me back up a second. Roughly speaking, when you think of the federal budget, we are spending $7 trillion each year. All right, and in fact, this year is almost exactly $7 trillion. And we bring in about $5 trillion in revenues, okay? That difference, right, is our, roughly speaking, $2 trillion deficit, okay? What is the federal government spending all that money on? All right, interest. This has become an increasing and very serious problem, how much money we are spending on net interest. It has become greater than what we are spending on national defense. You can see that here. There's defense down here, right? It's become greater here. 2025, that trend continues. In 2025, it actually has become greater than what we're spending on Medicare, okay? And that represents a significant jump in recent years because interest rates have gone up, right? And so we're paying more on that enormous balloon of $38 trillion in debt. All right, very important. If you add our net interest to our mandatory spending, we are at 73% of the federal budget, okay? To break it down a little bit, if you do Medicare, Social Security plus net interest, you're basically at 50% of our budget, okay? So when we talk about spending and people will say, oh, our federal government has a spending problem. In a sense, yes, but what is that spending problem? That spending problem lies in these areas here, okay? That is what is growing, and that is what we're gonna really focus on and think about here. We have other major healthcare programs, that is programs like Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, that is the Affordable Care Act, premium supports, things like that. We have other mandatory, that is things like Pell Grants, that is food stamps, and other programs like that. Again, all of those together, that is just all on autopilot too. When you and I think about a budget, we think about sitting down and planning for the year, making sure our expenditures and revenues meet. They don't do annual planning on this. These are just on autopilot. They just grow and grow and grow, okay? When we talk about the federal budget proper, we are really talking about our discretionary spending, which is a small and shrinking portion of our overall budget, because the rest of this is putting pressure on our discretionary budget. So here we have defense, 13%. You can think about this amount, about 25% of our budget, and it is divided in half between defense and other discretionary. All right? Embedded in other discretionary is all of those things that DOGE was trying to cut. That is our Department of Education, that is foreign aid, that is veterans, that is labor, that is all these other programs out there that we authorize on an annual basis and appropriate on an annual basis. So this is a very small portion of the budget. When the government shuts down, this is what is being shut down, not all of this other stuff. All right, so just want to kind of give you a sense of the scale of our problem here. Okay, over here on our revenue side, I just want to point out one thing, right? We got a lot of individual income tax, payroll tax, right? So this feels to all of us just like income tax, right? We are bringing in now a lot of revenues from tariffs, somewhere between $250 billion and $300 billion a year, if we keep the tariff regime the same over time, right? And so that, I just want you to understand the scale. It is big, but it's not that big compared to the overall problem here, okay? So $350 billion a year, $300 billion a year, that would be fantastic, but we're thinking we have to close a $2 trillion deficit, okay? And as we go through this, I want people to realize that, because everybody's got these great solutions, and they are great solutions, but you have to realize the scale of the challenge here. All right, in 10 years, this is just projections from CBO. You know, things may shift around depending on policies, but this is where we're headed. Net interest is 17%. Mandatory spending is 62%. All right, so basically 80% of our budget now is just mandatory spending on autopilot, and these parts of our budget, discretionary portions, are getting significantly squeezed. All right, this is why people will say that this is a national security problem, right? It is squeezing our ability to defend ourselves. It is squeezing our investments in ourselves, whether it be education or infrastructure. Those things are being crushed, in a sense, under the weight of these mandatory programs, the majority of which are in these healthcare and pension programs. All right. Okay, how did we get here? How did we lose that nice surplus we had back in 2000? Everybody's always interested in this. We obviously cut taxes. Social Security and Medicare are growing. They're growing in part because our population is aging, but also because healthcare system is, the costs of healthcare are growing faster than inflation. We added the Affordable Care Act. We made some changes in other mandatory. But I just, as you can see, as a share of sort of what happened, it was not in defense. A lot of my Democratic friends are like, oh, we're spending a lot on defense. That was not really driving this issue. Really, what's driving it, we cut taxes, and we have some expenditure side challenges. All right. People are often interested in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, what we just did, and what that means. All right, so what we did was we cut taxes. I will benefit significantly from this, so fantastic. However, my concern is that we really can't afford this, and it is going to drive up interest rates, it is going to drive up inflation, it is going to create a lot of problems on the back end for us. So we did these fantastic tax cuts, we extended the 2018 TCJA, lifted the SALT cap, child tax credit, R&D expensing, all sorts of great things like that. There was some big expenditure cuts. They were in Medicaid, food stamps, and student loans. We increased spending. This is the ICE, funding. This is Department of Defense funding that you're seeing there. So that added $3.4 trillion net to the deficit. But one of our big problems is that as we add to the deficit, right, we are also adding interest payments. So when you're thinking about increased spending, it's not just the things that you're really increasing on direct services, but when you add $3.4 trillion to the deficit, you have interest that you're going to have to pay on that amount, and that really accumulates. So when you look at the total tab for this, it's about $4.1 trillion, and the spending is a trillion increase in spending. All right, so even though people will say it's only 300 trillion increase, it is actually 700. I'm sorry, 700 billion. Those are decimals. All right, so let's think about the drivers of the budget for a minute. I'll kind of go through this, and then we will open the floor to questions. All right, so I've actually already pointed some of this out, which is that the big drivers, if you look at that, our 2024 up against 2035, what is really growing in that chart, what is really growing are these areas. Net interest, fastest growing part of our budget, Medicare, and Social Security. And they are what is slowly putting pressure on the rest of our budget. All right, so let's break this down, and we're going to start with the interest rates. Okay, this was very, very interesting to me. I actually didn't even know this when I was in Congress. It just sort of, it's one of those things. It's a mystery. Why is it that all of a sudden we're paying so much on interest payments? Why is it we are now paying more on interest than we're spending on national defense? Well, this is what's happened to interest rates. All right, we can go back 1962. Here, some of you guys may remember we had some real inflation problems. We had Paul Volcker, who was head of the Fed. He really pumped up those interest rates there. Just our interest rates over time. All right, you know, on average, we've been around 5.8%, and 4% if I had to kind of draw a line through this, eyeball it. All right, well, what happened? Okay, so you have the 2000s, and what you had was the Great Recession, and then you had the Federal Reserve taking action to really keep interest rates very, very low. So back in 2019, in the good old days, the first Trump administration, our interest rates that we were paying on our debt was around 2%. And that meant that our interest payments were around $400 billion, not close to $1 trillion that they are today. So what happened, right? The Fed, we had COVID, of course, so that crisis, but then the Federal Reserve decided to back off of the quantitative easing and other things they've been doing to kind of keep those interest rates low. Interest rates doubled, kind of recentering back to their historic level at around 4%. But because we have $38 trillion in debt, right, we have a big, big debt burden that we're carrying. That meant that our interest payments doubled, in essence, and went from around $441 billion to close to $1 trillion, right? So there we go. And the projections are, this is the CBO projections, is that it's going to stay around 4%. Now, we don't know that that's the case. This is just a guess. You can look at the 10-year Treasury note yields, which is a rough approximation of these interest rates on Treasury bills, and it was like 4.1% this morning, okay? So anyway, so that is one of the reasons these interest pressures are putting so much pressure on our budget. Here's another really, really interesting graph. Annual net interest payments is a share of revenues. When Moody's, did any of you guys follow Moody's downgrading the United States from a AAA bond-rated country to AA1? One of the things that they cited was our interest payments as a share of revenues. All right, this is shocking coming from a state environment, okay? In Georgia, we actually are capped. I don't remember if it's legal or constitutional. Georgia cannot have interest payments or debt service payments greater than, I believe it's 10% of net revenues, okay? The federal government is now around 20%. And that is one of the big things that Moody's cited when it said we are losing control of our debt. We are losing control of what's going on here, and sort of a cautionary note. And you can see this big jump that happened. So 1 out of every 5 of your tax dollars does not go to pay for services, does not go for defense, does not go for all the things you think it does. It just goes to pay interest on our debt. All right, and that is going to increase to 25%, most likely, in the next 10 years. So 1 out of every 4 of your tax dollars is going to go to these interest payments. All right, so the interest is one of these drivers. Rising healthcare costs are another one. This is a little bit hard to follow, but basically the red is the healthcare costs. They tend to be higher. This is the growth each year, healthcare costs tend to be higher than the overall inflation growth. And so that is affecting us. But this is the the massive, massive change that's happening to us. Our population is aging, okay? Over this period of time, 2025 to 2055, the population that is age 65 and older will grow by 36%. The percentage of our population age 24 and younger will decline by 12%. All right? And that has enormous implications for our fiscal health. What that is, these are people who, the baby boom generation is aging. They are starting to claim Social Security. They are claiming Medicare. And that is putting enormous pressure on our budget. Back in the 60s and 70s, it used to be that there were 4 working age people to every 1 retiree, and we are approaching 2 to every 1 retiree. All right. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that's putting pressure on us. I know I'm getting a little short of time here. All right, the 3% challenge, I talked about this. Okay, if we can cut the deficit below 3% of GDP, essentially cutting it in half, and growth is equal to or greater than this percentage, then we will at least stabilize debt to GDP. If we start now, so every year that goes by, we add more to the deficit and debt, there are more interest costs. So remember that $23 trillion number, you cut it in half, right, just mathematically, right, you're, 11.5 trillion. However, if we start right now, we will only have to cut 7.5 trillion over 10 years to get there because we will save on interest, okay? So that is one of the things that many of us in the kind of budget community are trying to get Congress to focus on a number like 7.5 trillion. It's over 10 years, okay? But just remember, right, that's $750 billion a year. We have $2 trillion in deficits. That $750 billion is relative to $7 trillion in spending. So it's about a little over a 10% cut, right, to our spending if we were just to take it out of that side of the equation. All right, there are always opportunities to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. But if we really want to address this issue, right, we're hoping interest is going to be addressed by just taking care of some deficit issues. So that's a big driver. We'll take care of that just by taking care of these other things. To really address this, we're going to have to tackle Social Security, Medicare, and revenues. There really is no way out. That is, these two plus interest are half of our budget. Okay, so thinking about Social Security, I'm going to skim across this, but we can talk about it in more detail if you're interested. All right, we have this huge problem. Luckily, this is sort of a crisis event coming up. In 2032, the Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out of money, precipitating this 24% cut to benefits. All right, just to give you a sense of the scale, my grandmother lived largely on Social Security benefits. She got $2,000 a month. If she faces a 24% across-the-board cut, she will be roughly living on, $1,500 a month. That's a big jump for someone like that, right? And she was, Great Depression era person, washed her plastic bags, took the trays from under the meat, kept it clean, reused that, all of those kinds of things. She lived very frugally. It'd be very, very hard for her to sustain a $500 a month cut. But that's kind of what is going to happen if we do nothing. If we were to tackle this issue entirely, right? Sorry, I keep looking at the wrong button here. If we were to cover this by general fund, we were to close that gap. I'll show you the Social Security gap right there. All right, here's what's happening with Social Security. If we were to close that gap over the next 10 years between their payroll taxes down here, and our expenditures, that's about $3.6 trillion. Okay, but let me stop on this. This is probably one of the most important graphs in the entire presentation. All right, what many people think is your payroll taxes pay for your Social Security benefits entirely. They don't, right? They have stopped covering it. And now our Social Security system, as of 2010, is running a deficit, okay? What we have is a trust fund, and I kind of use air quotes around that. But that was largely us saying, right, we will cover the difference, right? We will finance it from Treasury bills, which means it's deficit funded, we just owe it to ourselves. So we are covering this deficit. This differential right here is about $200 billion, right, that we are covering out of the Social Security Trust Fund, such as it is. That amount, right, we hit the limit on what was in that quote-unquote trust fund in 2032. At that point, this will be closer to a $500 billion shortfall, okay, between these two things. That explodes even further to around $1 trillion shortfall as we get into the out years. One of the reasons this is so important is what you are looking at in this differential, right, is potentially one of the largest wealth transfers from the younger generation to the older generation in American history. Maybe world history. I don't know. We're working on trying to see the scale. Why is that, right? We have a $38 trillion debt. Who is going to pay that off? It is the younger generation. Further, if we save Social Security, save everybody's benefits, who is going to pay for that? Who is going to pay for those retirees? It is the younger generation. Typically what happens throughout history is the older generation, they have wealth, they transfer it to the younger generation. But that's not what is happening here. We are transferring an enormous debt to our children, to our grandchildren. We ourselves will feel this, which is really, really challenging for us to think about. We are not leaving our children a stronger country than the one we inherited. And that's what this graph is showing. All right, how do we fix this? These are some of the ideas proposed from the Social Security trustees. There are many, many ideas on the table. We can do this. One might be to increase the payroll tax. Right? Every year that goes by, though, it gets harder and harder to fill that hole, because we're not setting aside money to fill it in the future. To give you a sense of this, we would have to increase the payroll tax, this is in 2034, by 34% to fill the hole. What does that mean? All right, in Social Security, we pay about 12.4% of our income, right, goes into the Social Security Trust Fund. We pay about 6.2, our employer pays 6.2 to get there. A 34% increase takes that 12.4%, bumps it up to 16.6%. If you make $100,000 a year, your payroll taxes paid by your employer and yourself are about $12,400. They will increase to $16,600. Okay, that's $4,200 difference. And you can split that. You will pay about $2,100. This is what this means. If you make $100,000 a year, you'll pay about $2,100 more in taxes a year. If we do this, that will entirely fill the hole for the next through 2055. So just things that are on the table. We can cut benefits for beneficiaries. This is those cuts at essentially this is the same as that 24% across the board cut I'm talking about. Or we can just wipe out new beneficiaries, okay? By the time we get to 2034, we could cut every single benefit for every new person coming into the system, and it still won't cover the whole. So, but these are things that are out there. Here are some other things. Remember, over the next 10 years to cover the shortfalls, it would be about 3.6 trillion. All right, and one of the things is people don't understand the scale that we really have to hit, okay? One of the very popular proposals, we do simulations where we have people try different ideas out. And one of the most popular ones is to eliminate the payroll tax cap. Okay, so after you make, I think it's $184,000, you no longer have to pay that payroll tax. Okay, fantastic. You also don't get more benefits, right? Your benefits are also capped out too. But what if we just lifted that? People $184,000 on up to our bajillionaires, they all pay that 12.4% tax on their income. If we do that, that will raise about $3.2 trillion. That gets us, over the next 10 years, it gets us part of the way, not all the way, but it gets us part of the way there. But those are the kind of things we have to be thinking about, and that's kind of the scale we have to be thinking about to get out of this. Medicare, right, we have similar challenge with the Medicare Trust Fund running out of money. going to skip to this. One of our challenges with Medicare is not even partially covered by the payroll tax, okay? We pay a modest payroll tax, right, out of our income. I think that ends up being about 3% total. Yep, about 1.45 for the employer, 1.45 for the employee, about 2.9%, right? And that makes up a tiny fraction of our overall Medicare spending. We pay premiums. If you're in Medicare, right, you pay premiums. That helps cover some of the shortfall. But overall, most of Medicare, at least half, is financed out of the general fund. Just like with Social Security, as the population ages, all of a sudden, these costs are going to explode, all right? And we have to deal with this crisis. This is why this is going to put a lot of pressure on the rest of the budget. All right. Flip through that. Here are some options. Again, these are available in different places. These slides are not on our webpage yet, but we will put them up there. Largely, you can see some of the options, changing the age of eligibility, but a lot of them involve changes to how we reimburse people for health insurance, particularly taking Medicare Advantage, doing changes around that. All right, the last kind of area we're going to have to tackle is revenues. And here, one of the things we've looked at is back here when we were actually balanced, revenues were about 19.4% of the budget. So if we were to raise it, I think I've got a calculation in here, to be similar to what it was back in 2000, so going from about 18% to 19.4%, that would help us raise $6.8 trillion. Again, remember that 7.5 is what we've got our eyes on, right? So we could do that. We could cover a huge amount of cutting the deficit in half if we did that. What kind of tax changes would this require? I have a lot of Democratic friends who are like, let's tax the rich. Can contribute some. This is the Elizabeth Warren wealth tax, right? That will bring you $2.1 trillion, okay? It will help some, that's over 10 years. But again, you're up against a total $2 trillion deficit. You're trying to hit $7.5 trillion just to cut it in half, okay? So it can get you some of the way there, but not all of the way. Anyway, these are some other, kind of ones that have been popular over time. This is the carbon tax. A lot of people, economists love that one. Capital gains, increasing corporate income tax, right? Give you a sense of the scale, right? How are we going to get there? All right, so just a brief conclusion here, which is that we really have very simple math. We have to close that gap. We have to take that $23 trillion and bring that down. Some of that we can do with growth, right? Some of that we can do with interest savings if we start cutting or raising revenues now. But one way or another, we are going to have to be making some hard choices. Are these going to bankrupt us? No. Are they things that people may fuss about a bit? Yes, but we can do it. We can do this. If we don't do this, though, we will pay for it another way. We will pay for it through economic crisis. One of the challenges, again, I often have tried to present this to the Democratic caucus, and they're all like, the debt and deficit is only something Republicans care about when they're not in power. Why should we care about it? It is always used to undermine our priorities, spending on programs that we care about and our constituents care about. The problem is this is actually an enormous social justice problem, because I cannot imagine anything worse than hitting something like hyperinflation. Who do you think is going to pay? Who do you think is going to bear the burden of this? If we decide to address it in chaotic fashion, right? It will be the most hard off among us who will bear the terrible burden of that. The wealthy, they'll have their money in inflation indexed funds and things like that. They'll be okay. But it's the folks at the bottom who will really, really suffer. And that is one of the many reasons we need to address this. Last of all, we are not leaving our children and grandchildren a mess like this. We were not given a mess like this, and we need to get out of this mess. And so this is one of the reasons I feel extremely passionately about this issue. I do want to throw this up here. If you are interested in being involved more in this dialogue and debate. We send out a regular newsletter. We put forward different bills that are helping us solve this problem. We are bipartisan, right? We just ask that bills be paid for. We ask that members of Congress take constructive steps to cut the debt. So please join us and be involved in that effort. With that, thank you for having me here. I'm happy to take questions. Phil, do you want to? Okay, so here is my fabulous field director, Phil Smith. We do have sign-up sheets as well. You can look at the QR code and go sign up through that. But we also have sign-up sheets that he's going to pass around here if you want to get our newsletter, if you want to be involved in some of these efforts.
For those of you that have questions, please sign up at the mic. That's important, not just so we can hear each other, but also so people online.
Thank you very much for coming today. I was just wondering what your opinion is on the way that the debt ceiling currently functions, and on if you think any modifications to that process are necessary.
Okay, great question. What we do is every few years, we have this sort of statutory debt ceiling. We run up against it. We can't issue more than, where are we, 38 trillion, we can't issue more than 45 trillion or something like that. We will hit that ceiling, and all of a sudden the Treasury Department will have to go into extraordinary measures to try to make sure that we're able to meet our debt obligations. Our problem is, of course, that if we were not to make our payments make our interest payments, this would precipitate a terrible, terrible fiscal crisis. And it would, once people lost faith in the full faith and credit of the United States, that would cause interest rates to rise. We could get into a debt spiral. Interest rates rise. We have to issue more debt in order to pay for the interest payments. That in turn causes more debt to have to be out there, which causes interest rates to rise again, which causes us to have to issue more debt. So it could precipitate a terrible crisis. Not only would it bring down this country in crisis, but one of the things to recognize about our debt is we are special. 34% of all the sovereign debt in the world is the United States debt. So if we go down, we will take the world with us, for better or worse. I think one of the hopes is we're too big to fail, but I'm not sure what that means in this context exactly, except that if we hit sort of hyperinflation, severe economic crisis, this will likely be very, very contagious. So in the interest of not destroying our economy and the global economy, right, it's a real problem that we run up against this and we have this kind of showdown around these inflection points around our debt. The challenge is that there is no other circuit breaker for our Congress. There's no other time that they actually start to really confront these issues. So one of the things we are interested in, there's a bill that was just introduced that we are supporting that would require, at least before they try to either have some automatic increase or deal with this in some way, that they will lay out the fiscal situation. The executive branch will lay out sort of what the fiscal situation is, and will put on the table a proposal to cut the debt that will go before Congress for an automatic vote. So we would like to see something like that as a condition of making those debt ceiling increases automatic.
Hi, thank you very much. The 24% across the board cut to Social Security in 2032, that's only about 6 years away.
That is.
Is there anybody in Congress or the executive branch that's actively pursuing a way to take care of this problem?
Well, I was informed that last week they passed a sense of the Senate. I think this was Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, Republican, and Tom Kaine from Virginia, Democrat, that it was a problem. And they sent it to me and they're like, we'd like you to publicize this. I'm like, no. Come on, get your act together. Let's start addressing it. I do think they are very aware of it. The problem right now is we are extremely polarized. And however, whether you work with us or do it independently, it would be a very good idea to start weighing in with your members of Congress, your senators, because it's going to happen within a Senate term, to start being much more definitive about how they're going to address this problem.
Thank you very much. So in a democracy where we elect our representatives on 2-year and 6-year terms, doesn't seem the best system to deal with short-term pain for long-term gain, either the deficit or maybe even climate change. So have you seen in the past where we've dealt with a similar situation like this, where people have stood up and actually made those difficult decisions? And just the other thing is, you seem to have to convince a lot of people about a pretty difficult subject.
Yeah. So yes, I have. In fact, I worked with the Georgia legislature. They were elected on 2-year terms, all of them, with Senate and House. And when it came time, they had to fill a 20% budget shortfall during the Great Recession. And they came in and they said, our number one job is to pass a budget and to pass it one that's balanced. And they did it. Now they backfilled with some stimulus funds. They did have some help along the way. This was the Republican legislature. They did everything. They cut expenditures. They raised revenues. They worked extremely hard, and they were able to balance the budget. They have a balanced budget amendment at the state level, and this is something that Concord has long advocated for. Our problem is right now that we're running those $2 trillion deficits. We have to slope in closing that so that we don't precipitate a recession by cutting it too fast. So we're in a little bit of a bind right now. We can't just say balance it right now. We have to slope in a balanced process. However, I do think there's space for a balanced budget amendment to be put back on the table once we have closed that or gotten closer, because there does have to be that push behind our elected officials. You are correct, right? They only see that 2-year window. And what was very interesting to me, my background is in state, public finance, state budgeting, is that states very regularly go in and they balance the budget under extreme conditions. And it's not just the balanced budget amendment. It is that there is a culture of it. And the members themselves can go and tell the public, look, I have to balance the budget because of this balanced budget amendment. As a budget person, I actually know all sorts of ways that states can cheat that system, okay? They don't actually have to balance. And it was very interesting to me to watch this dynamic play out. There are all sorts of, they can short their pension fund, right? Is something that a lot of states do. They can short their long-term health benefits. They can raid all sorts of reserves. There are all sorts of things they can do. Not as much as the federal government. They can't print money like the federal government. But anyway, we need to create these constraints, right? And the constraints, if we can create them in a credible way, they can help change the culture of Congress so that they walk in and they say, our number one job is to pass a budget each year and to make sure it is balanced. So that is what ultimately the long-term vision here is. Clint? Next.
Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Thank you, Caroline. Great job. My question is really around Social Security. And that chart that you put up there, I thought Social Security in particularly is a unique animal in that whole mix, and that it's broad-based, but then also arguably that it's really been paid for pretty effectively over time. I mean, if you think about the fact that if it behaved like a normal trust fund, there were dollars there to help us through a demographic winter, at least until 2034.
Yep.
So let's say, fast forward, we have a solution and it involves compromise, a combination of some benefit cuts, delayed benefits, and increased payroll taxes. What should we be doing about thinking about redesigning that system so there's some public confidence there? Because I think that one challenge is just the brutal politics of that, is that it's a really challenging thing to discuss if there isn't some sort of level of confidence that, we have this, it's here, it's dedicated, it's not being diverted. I know the budget's more complicated than that at the federal level, but I just wonder if you had comments on that.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very interesting idea. And one of the things that we are talking about among ourselves as potential ways to approach this is to truly restore the integrity to the idea of a trust fund, which is the idea that used to be this, I think Al Gore proposed, he called it a lockbox idea, where the money you pay into social, it can only be used for that. It actually does not just go to help finance our deficit, which is what it's been used for. It really does have to be segregated as a way of trying to restore confidence in the system, that if your tax dollars go up, you can be assured that it's going into Social Security, right? And you're going to be assured that that is going to then pay for your future benefits, the benefits for your parents, your grandparents, things like that. So I think restoring integrity to these trust funds, I would like to see a serious conversation around Medicare also, right? So that we think of that holistically, like that too pays for itself. It is a trust fund. It is dealt with in a trust fund-like fashion. We also have a highway trust fund. We have a Pell Grant. We have several other trust funds that are running out of money. And it would go a huge way to closing the deficit, restoring fiscal integrity, to bring integrity back to those trust funds and make them self-financing over the long haul. Yes?
Given the difficulty with both parties experiencing a confidence that spending helps their constituents or the other party, tax cuts help theirs, I just wonder what the education challenge is for both the public and elected officials about actual macroeconomics. I mean, it seems very complicated. The state of Missouri has been for 25 years pushing tax cut. It also has a constitutional requirement for a balanced budget.
Yep.
Over those 25 years, we've become the 6th lowest tax state in America. So naturally, we've got a booming economy. No, we're the 6th lowest growth economic GDP per capita growth over the same last 25 years. But it doesn't seem like anybody, I'm actually in the process of trying again. It just seems like there's not a receptivity to that really by either party. And I wondered how you're going to deal with, or how we could deal with the education challenge.
There are many layers in that. There's a whole macroeconomic piece of that, which I leave it to my fabulous economists to educate their legislators about dynamic effects and things like that. I used to do a lot of that. But in terms of educating Congress, a lot of that starts with us reaching out to them and asking them to start addressing this issue. We are worried about it. Pointing them in constructive ways to address these issues. So for instance, right now there are several bills. There is a Fiscal Commission Act that is a BRAC-like bill where on a bipartisan basis, people will get together. They will put a proposal on the table to stabilize debt to GDP, and then it will go to the floor for an automatic vote, right? So getting people to support that. There's a 3% resolution out there, which has been supported on a bipartisan basis. So we're getting movement here slowly. It's like rubbing sticks together. But as we start to make the ask, right, they do start to respond. And they have been responding on a bipartisan basis, though it is extremely tough up there right now. I sat in a meeting with Democrats and Republicans who gotten together, off the record to sit down and talk about this issue. Republicans will say, they will not say it publicly, but they say we got to put revenues on the table. Democrats will say, we have to tackle Social Security. We have to tackle healthcare costs. We have to bring them down. The problem is getting them to be able to go out into the public and talk about this. And their perception on both sides is that when they do this, their head will be whacked off, right? The other side will take advantage of that. So part of the strategy right now is to try to get them to join hands and jump off, not a huge cliff, but a gentle cliff together and to try to make the reforms that we so desperately need. All right. Thank you. Good to visit with you all. Okay.
Violate my own rules here. I just want to take a moment and thank Dr. Bordeaux for a really phenomenal talk. I couldn't think of a better way to kick off our Wiedenbaum season, both in terms of the topic, but also in terms of the speaker. An academic expert who heard and took the call of public service and is now out translating, really complicated but important topics for all of us. So please join me one more time in thanking her for that excellent talk. I have a couple of announcements. I want to note that if you want to keep this conversation going and get your hands a little dirty, tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Dr. Bordeaux and her colleagues will be leading a federal budget simulation. This is interactive, and I believe everyone is invited. This will allow participants to really think about what these proposals will mean and what the negotiation and interactions look like to get there. This event will take place at the Danforth University Center. We're co-sponsoring. We're working with the Gephardt Center on that, for which we're very grateful. Full details are available on our website at wc.washu.edu. I strongly encourage you to attend. I think it's going to be a really fantastic experience. Before we end, I want to note that you should have got a flyer and a program. Please take a look at our events for the spring. I want to highlight that one event that is so new it didn't actually make it on the list. In response to the rapidly unfolding developments in Venezuela, we've scheduled a rapid response pop-up event with Dr. Krister Knapp from History, who will discuss the Monroe Doctrine and what recent signals from the Trump administration suggest about continued U.S. engagement with Venezuela. The bad news is that interest has been so strong that the event is almost all sold out, but you can still sign up for the wait list, and hopefully you'll get lucky and be able to join us for that. January 21st, our conference room in the Wiedenbaum Center. See, I just stand up here and read what Elizabeth hands me. And next, I invite you to join us all for a reception outside. But before we do that, join me one more time in thanking Dr. Carolyn Bordeaux for a great talk.